an open meeting.
Well, I was hoping to roll pretty much straight from that into the executive session.
Well, then there won't be any questions.
It's not going to be anyway.
Yeah, I would prefer to put it here just so it doesn't interrupt the flow of the rest of the discussion. If there are questions, we will hear them. But we need to vote on the agenda. Call roll call.
Director Crum?
Here.
Yes.
Yes.
Director Nasser?
Here,
Director Witherell?
Yes.
Chairperson Smant?
Yes.
Hang on, different page. Mayor Manetza?
Yes.
Councilman Fritz?
Yes.
Councilman Cummins?
Yes.
Councilman Dora?
Yes.
Councilman Scott?
Yes.
All right, let's open a call to the audience. So members of the audience in attendance today are welcome to address the joint body here with any questions or comments you may have on any subject. Please come to the microphone.
Good afternoon, assembled boards. Andy Cawthon, 50 Howard, Grand Haven, BLP ratepayer, candidate for BLP. And I second John's comment about the point of public comment. It would be more valuable to me, at least, and perhaps to the listening audience, to have heard some of the discussion and be able to comment on that. But otherwise, what's the point of the comment? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right, I'm going to close the call to the audience then. We'll move on into our discussion review of the Harbor Island follow-up environmental testing results. And I believe that that goes to Arthur.
Thank you. You have before you a letter dated July 6th to your council. I'm going to go a little bit out of the order of the letter to walk you through various issues. There's really 4 substantive issues to a lesser extent EPA on behalf of the BLP since our last meeting, which I think was in March, which we attended remotely. The first is the issue of the former Unit 3 impoundments, and I'm going to refer to them as a singular, even though at one point in time they were 2 separate impoundments. The barrier between them is gone. They're effectively one big bathtub. And as I think you know, that impoundment was built back in the 1980s. It's been in use ever since. Under state law, there was an obligation to bring that impoundment to closure by the end of last year, by the 28th of December of last year. And without rehashing too much of the history that we went through the last time, a lot of work was done to remove all of the ash that was within the footprint of the impoundment. There was a number of tests that were done within the footprint of the impoundment. What was left, which was basically clay. If you flip to page 5 of the letter, you can see that work was done. There was visual inspection. There was a photographic confirmation of that inspection. Something called colorimetric testing, which is basically use of a comparison of different colors because the ash has a different color profile from the ash does from the clay. So you can compare colors to see whether or not you've got a predominance of clay or predominance of ash or any ash whatsoever. There was a microscopic evaluation done and then a chemical analysis that was done. Since our last meeting, there has been an exchange of correspondence with Eagle. Eagle raised a specific concern regarding the chemical analysis that was done of the clay materials that were left. and said, we're not satisfied that you've gotten all the ash out, boiling it down to its essence. One of the things that they raised in the dialogue was, well, if you knew where the clay was coming from or had come from originally back in the early 1980s, that might change our mind. And the staff of the BLP went and did some evaluation and some investigation, determined that they could find a location, they found the location that the clay originated from. They found a gentleman who'd worked on the project and was able to speak pretty comprehensively on this. This is where it came from. The BLP went out and sampled the clay, the native clay in that area, in that location, and ran an analysis. Now, to sort of close the loop on this discussion, when we started this process, when the BLP started it, there was sampling done, and there was a list of 22 different elements or chemicals that the state wanted evaluated for. Basically, the state has a hierarchy of processes that you can go through to demonstrate that material that you're testing is basically within a background range and therefore considered native or naturally occurring material, isn't impacted, doesn't need to be removed or otherwise addressed. We've now reduced that list of 22 that were open to question down to 3. There's three compounds, 3 elements. They're iron, arsenic, and selenium. Those are the 3 compounds that are still somewhat at issue. I can tell you that, we've gone through an analysis. We've submitted, the BLP has submitted through its consultants a technical evaluation explaining how the detection of these compounds to them appears to be naturally occurring. That compounds that you would, if there was ash remaining in the clay, you'd be finding more than just those 3 compounds. There are a number of compounds you'd expect to find. None of them were found at elevated levels, except for these 3 compounds, and the elevated levels were not dramatically elevated, but they were above the state background standards and above the standards from the source material for the clay. So, and that happens. There's variability, and every sample is different. Depending if you step 1 foot to the right or go down 6 inches deeper, you may get a slightly different analysis. You can sample forever and to try to figure out what the actual true background is. That submission is sitting with the state. We've not heard back from them in response to that, and we're still waiting on it. But the expectation is, given that the process that we've been through up until now, that the agency is going to take a somewhat conservative approach and say that they still don't think that the clay materials have been completely cleaned of all residuals, and that they want those clay materials removed. This is significant basically for a couple of reasons. One is there's an expense associated with removing that clay, because you have to remove it, and then if you deem it as impacted, you have to take it to a landfill for disposal. Can't just move it and get rid of it as clean fill. You've got to literally dispose of it. Perhaps even more importantly, during the course of the work that's been done out at the facility, it's been determined that there's ash sitting under that clay, that clay bathtub was basically built on a field that included some soils. It also included some ash that had been placed there historically as fill, as basically as beneficial use to build up the island. That becomes a problem because by scraping off the old clay, you will have exposed this ash area, about 1 acre in size, which means it will be exposed to the elements, it will be exposed to rainfall, inundation, and theoretically then could result in further leaching of materials from that ash. That's what lawyers call exacerbation. You will exacerbate the condition out there, you'll make it worse. So in order to avoid that, you'd have to do something which is basically cap that area, put it back the way it is right now, literally put down a layer of clay. The cost between the estimate for the cost of removing the clay, disposing of the clay, and then replacing it, and of course that would have to be done in sort of a coordinated mechanism and method to make sure that you didn't leave it open for too long. The estimate's about $750,000. That's a significant expense to remove clay, which bluntly, we believe is clean. It's just regular old clay. The agency is still reviewing the information that's been submitted, but given their very narrow interpretation of their regulations up to this point, we're not particularly encouraged that they're going to come back and agree with our conclusion, even though we think it's the correct conclusion. So that's an issue with respect to the 3A and 3B impoundments. The other issue with respect to that impoundment, and I'll talk about this more in a little bit, relates to the groundwater testing that's been done in the area around that impoundment. One of the requirements of the statute is to sample the groundwater, monitor it for impacts. And the groundwater does appear, not surprisingly, to be impacted. It's not surprising because, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's ash and probably some waste, some garbage, some trash mixed in as well under the footprint of the impoundment. So it's not a surprise that the groundwater would be impacted. We pretty much expected it to be. We've explained to the agency that through means of a document called an alternate source demonstration report, that the groundwater appears to be impacted either from this former beneficial fill or from perhaps the other on-site impoundment, what we call the Unit 1-2 impoundment. The agency has not accepted that conclusion as of yet. Again, there's been a further exchange of information. There's been correspondence as recent as June and then I think early July in response. Basically, the agency has come back and said, well, we don't think that, we don't agree with your conclusion. We provide that, just as we've done with the clay, we've provided them additional analysis and information, and we're awaiting their response. So as far as Unit 3A and 3B are concerned, those are the two sort of big issues that are still outstanding. Candidly, this should be fairly straightforward, which will become important when we talk about the other issues, which are more complicated, believe it or not. There is an area around the Unit 3 impoundment in a couple of locations where the agency has said some additional cleanup is necessary because in the deep, dark, distant past, sometimes materials, ash would be, as they were loading it for hauling off site, some ash would be spilled or some ash would be, in fact, staged. In some cases, they put it up at the top of the berm before they would load it up and take it away, that there may still be some residuals on the outside of the berm or in the roadway outside the berm. I was out there today looking at the facility with Mr. Booth, and I couldn't see any evidence of anything there. It looked just like it was all brown clay to me. I'm a lawyer, not an environmental engineer, so maybe there's something there that I missed, but I certainly didn't see it. But a commitment has been made, and some materials have already been removed from the roadway around that impoundment to address that concern. And a commitment was made by the BLP to, if there's additional areas that need to be removed or confirmed through some of the same mechanisms that were done previously on the inside of the impoundment, that will be done. So, and we believe Eagle should be satisfied with that commitment, and they've not said anything to the contrary. That brings us to perhaps the more complicated issue, which is the Unit 1-2 impoundment. And just by reference to the letter, if you look at page 9, that's where that discussion picks up. The Unit 1-2 impoundment, as we talked about the last time we were together, or last time we were together electronically, the Unit 1-2 impoundment is not the same sort of impoundment as the Unit 3 impoundment. Unit 3, as I said, is basically, in my parlance, it was a clay bathtub built on top of the island, and it was on top of the ash field. The Unit 1-2 impoundment is, frankly, more of a low area in the island, in the field of material that's out there, which includes some ash that was used for beneficial fill, some waste that was disposed of over the history, going back perhaps even as far back as 120 years ago on the island, perhaps in some cases actually helping to build up the island. And that area received ash from the former Unit 1-2 generator. That's why it's called the Unit 1-2. So it has nothing to do with the number of impoundments or anything like that. It has to do with the source of the material that went into it. We frankly, and we talked about this and just by way of refresher, we talked about this on the last meeting. One of the big issues we were struggling with was there was a pretty decent conceptual agreement with Eagle about the footprint of that impoundment. And towards the end of last year, we were informed by Eagle that they had taken that to EPA for their concurrence, and the US EPA did not agree. They wanted a larger footprint than we had discussed with Eagle and had defined. That kicked off a series of discussions, which pretty much ended in mid-January of this year. And that resulted in a revised footprint that was agreed to by all the parties, EPA, Eagle, and the BLP. That's important because it relates to the area to be closed, because that area still does need to be closed. It has not gone through any sort of process the way Unit 3 has. And it relates to the area that needs to be monitored, the groundwater monitoring. Again, Unit 3, just by juxtaposition, it's a bathtub, and if you saw that bathtub out there, you'd be able to recognize it. It sits up on the island. You can see where the boundary is, where the border is. You know what you're monitoring. Unit 1-2 is a little bit more difficult because if you went out there and looked at it, you wouldn't be able to see any sort of physical barrier or boundary delineating its extent. There had to be an agreement on that because the monitoring program that's required by the federal rule and the state law is that you're supposed to monitor it pretty much adjacent to the edge of the impoundment. So that delineation was critically important. Following the agreement on the delineation in January, the BLP began working on a revised monitoring plan, something that Eagle and I think EPA had said that they wanted. And a revised monitoring plan was submitted. Now, there already is a groundwater monitoring program out there. It consists of, is it 10 wells? 10 wells. Around basically the entire Sims site in different locations. Eagle was not satisfied with that. They want more sampling points. They wanted different upgradient points to see if they can figure out where what the upgradient condition of the groundwater is. And they wanted additional monitoring points, both down gradient and closer to the impoundments. So now that we have a footprint of the impoundments, we submitted a monitoring plan. And it took the agency about a month to respond to it. And they said, they didn't like it. They wanted modifications made to it. And most importantly, they said that they wanted a better definition of the groundwater flow direction at the site before they'd approve a monitoring program. And that's important because obviously if you don't know which way the groundwater is flowing, you don't know if you're looking at an upgradient well or a downgradient well or what's being impacted. And I will say that the groundwater, and I think we talked about this the last time, the groundwater flow at the site is fairly complicated. And it's complicated because the island sits in the middle of the river. The river has influence on a number of sides. And it also depends, frankly, on the level of the river, because that's going to have influence. If the river is low, groundwater is going to flow towards it. If the river is high, there may be flow in towards the island. And that's just, again, I'm not a hydrogeologist. That's my basic understanding of it from your experts, but it's pretty commonsensical. It makes sense. And given what you guys went through in the last year and a half with the river being high, the lakes being high, the water levels being high, the flooding at the island, there definitely is some question about groundwater flow direction, whether it's perpetually in one direction, whether it reverses flow direction, which does happen, depending on the height of the river, or whether it's something called a radial flow, literally flowing in a circular pattern. And the information, while we think we've got that pretty well understood, the agency disagreed. They want more information, which is not uncommon. It happens all the time. The most common dialogue between regulator and regulated party is the regulator saying, well, thank you for the information. We'd like more. Go out and get some more. Happens all the time. So this is not an uncommon process by any stretch of the imagination. So they wanted a new evaluation of groundwater flow direction, and the BLP staff and your consultants, Golder, went and developed a plan, and it was submitted, and the agency came back and said, well, we like it, but we want nips and tucks. We want changes made. We want some additional things. One of the things they want to specifically evaluate is the actual water level in the river, presumably to see what the directness of the effect is between the river and the groundwater table in the island. And the BLP and Golder came back and said, yes, we will do that. Because some of the wells are in areas that are regulated as, and that was approved by Eagle. Eagle agreed to that, and they approved it. And you would think we'd be out there putting the wells in right now, and we would like to be, the BLP would like to be, except for they need to get a wetland permit from Eagle. And because some of these areas are definitely regulated wetlands. And we've just learned today, I think it was, that, the plan here is rather than spending money, recklessly and having to spend money twice, the goal here is some of these locations we're reasonably certain are going to be long-term permanent monitoring wells. Doesn't make sense to go out and put in a short-term well to have to go back out 6 months or a year later to put in a permanent well. Make it a permanent well now, save the money of having to go back and do it twice. We learned today that Eagle, apparently the water resources folks who permit wetlands, are balking at the installation of a fairly relatively small concrete pad for the location of the well, which it would need to be if it was permanent. Because if you put in a temporary well, eventually it's gonna degrade. If you put in a concrete pad, that your permanent well will be a permanent well. So that's something we need to sort out. It's a little point, but it actually becomes important later on. And it's a pretty good example of what the BLP has been struggling with, which is one agency said, or one arm of the same agency says do this, and the other arm of the agency says no. So we're a little bit betwixt and between. With respect to, so that talks about groundwater monitoring of the Unit 1-2 impoundment. What we haven't talked about is the closure process. This gets a little into the tall grass in terms of the legalities of it, but there is an argument to be made that Eagle really has no jurisdiction over this impoundment because of the way its statute is written. It's an open question. The agency will tell you that they think it does apply and that BLP is subject to a closure requirement by the state of Michigan. They have agreed with us. Well, let me go back a step. Originally, they were saying that the closure had to happen on the same timeline as the closure for Unit 3. We went through the issues of the law with them, and ultimately, I did. And ultimately, as a result of our efforts, they changed their position and are now saying, yes, we still think it needs to be closed. We still think it's required to be closed under state law, but it's not subject to the December 28th, 2020 deadline. They have not told us what they think the deadline is. That said, we agree with EPA at least, that EPA certainly has jurisdiction. And under the EP, because the laws are written differently, they don't define the terms exactly the same. And under EPA jurisdiction, absolutely the Unit 1-2 impoundment, defined as an impoundment, does need to achieve closure. And the closure processes for both the state and the federal rules are basically the same. They're not worded exactly the same, but they're basically the same. And you really have two options. Before I get to the options, what did we determine the date was that we thought was the earliest date that closure would be required? Was it 2023? 2023. I think it's October of 2023. So you see, we have a little more time to get that done. And while that sounds like a lot of time, it's not a lot of time because there's a lot more work to be done. That would be the EPA's date. And Eagle hasn't told us their date. I would expect that they'll probably follow EPA on that, but I don't know. None of us do because they haven't told us what they're thinking is. They've just said, we'll get back to you on that, but we still think you need to be closing this under our rules as well as under the federal rules. There's really two options to achieve closure here. One is removal, and the other is stabilization and capping in place. Those are pretty much the only two options. Now, it sounds like there's, one's one way and one's the other. The likelihood is that even if you were going to close it in place with stabilization and capture, there would need to be some dewatering and there would need to be some removal in order to stage the cap. If you're going to remove it, then there's definitely going to be dewatering because there's large areas of water within the footprint of what they've defined as the unit. And then there would have to be removal. Now, there are a number of concerns And we talked through some of them the last time, I believe. The biggest issue, I think, is that the BLP's consultant, the BLP, and to a lesser extent as a non-engineer, me, are all concerned that a full removal, which was the original plan that was written when we thought it was a smaller, more concentrated area that needed to be addressed, and before all the flooding, and that plan of removal was submitted to Eagle back in 2019, I believe. Is that right? 2019. Is risky for a couple of reasons. One is that practically, even though we have a definition and an agreement on the footprint of the impoundment, on one side of the impoundment, well, on the inside of the impoundment is definitely ash, and we believe that there's also waste. On the outside of that impoundment, unlike the Unit 3, where there's that barrier of clay, right outside the footprint, there is ash and there is waste. So if we're trying to define when we've gotten to a clean edge, I don't think that's viable. I don't think that's possible. So that's one practical problem. The even greater concern is the possibility that by digging down in that area, you might actually create a sort of a funnel effect, if you will, where ash material would actually go down into the groundwater table and out into the river. And that's obviously a serious concern. As Mr. Booth and I were talking about earlier, the federal regulation and the state law were both written with the understanding that they were trying to prevent exactly that scenario. They don't want to see stuff mobilized into water bodies, which is a laudable goal. That's what we're all about, that protecting the environment, that's the goal. This concern has been brought to the attention of Eagle and EPA, but primarily Eagle. Eagle's response is that they are not persuaded that this is a real risk. Now, what I can tell you is that BLP went out on its own without any direction from anybody and sampled at the surface water, and I think we may have talked about this the last time. If we did, I apologize. Did sampling at the edge of the water, basically along the river's edge. And while there were some detections of some levels of ash constituents, they were all below any level of significant concern. Basically, under our view, that could continue to stay exactly as it is. So the concern about going in and digging this up and possibly creating that funnel effect I was talking about a moment ago is a real concern, because we could make matters significantly worse. That concern's been raised with Eagle. They've said they're not convinced. We've asked them, what information, or how would we go about demonstrating or confirming your view that it's not a concern, or confirming our view that it is a concern? And we've gotten no response, no cooperation, no insight on this. Now, they're the regulators, they're the folks who know this stuff, statewide, and they have the access to EPA to get information there as well. It's a significant risk. Is it a 1% risk? Is it a 0.1% risk? Is it a 10% risk? We can't say. We don't know. But you have to balance that risk against the magnitude of the harm if it should occur, and that could be very significant. So there's a significant risk to doing the excavation, even if we're able to do it and know where the edge is, know where to stop, confirm that we've hit the edge, satisfy the agency. There's also, quite candidly, I guess in my view, it's sort of an interesting conundrum to say, well, we've dug up this ash, but we're leaving this ash here. I'm not sure that I see the environmental benefit to doing just a centralized area. We also looked at, and are continuing to look at, the issue of dewatering, stabilization, and capping. And the consultants are still looking at that now. We recently, in the last week, received a letter or an email from Eagle saying, well, if you're going to change your plan, you've got to run it through us and get our approval. I'm not sure that last part is really accurate under the statute of the rules. That's an open question, but I don't think the BLP has any objection to working with the agency on trying to look at an alternative. I will tell you, and I shared this with your council earlier this spring, we did have, and it's over a much larger area, we did look at cost estimates for either capping or removal. And for purposes of our discussion, we talked about an 18-acre area that needed to be addressed, which is larger than the footprint of the Unit 1, 2 impoundment as everyone's defined it. It would be, I think, a somewhat significantly larger area. And this is not a quote. This is not an estimate. This is really basically for you to see the difference between the two approaches of removing and capping. And and I'm just going to give you the bottom line, but certainly this information has been made available to council and can be made available to any of you, with the understanding that it is not it's not been bid, it's not been, it is really a very rough estimate just for purposes of comparison of orders of magnitude. But I can tell you that at an 18-acre cap, including contingencies and a variety of expenses, and assuming that there would be some removal of ash, and they were estimating 5,000 tons, which is probably 5,000 yards, give or take. They were looking at a $21 million expenditure. That includes putting in, sheet piling in some locations, and a variety of other expenses. The full removal, again, apples to apples, 18-acre site, same thing. There you're talking about almost 350,000 tons of material to be removed. And I think the assumption was that it was all ash. No, they were ash and trash. Okay. But the order of magnitude there was $48 million in change. So yes, basically four times as much. So that gives you an idea of, again, not necessarily the exact dollar cost by any stretch of the imagination, but the difference between removal and capping. Capping is significantly less expensive, which obviously makes sense.
Arthur, I just want to point out for a minute, that's for 18 acres, and that's why that number is different than the number that we've been using, which is like 18 million or something like that.
Correct.
We don't really think we're going to need to do the full 18
Correct.
acres.
Correct.
How does that compare to the EPA delineation for orange? You say this
18 acres is larger.
How much larger?
Do you know what the acreage is of the area that we've delineated? I think it's about, is it about 3 to 4 acres?
I guess closer to 5.
It's about 5 acres. So it's about a third the size. You could probably reduce those numbers by a third, assuming that that's where you all get to stop.
Well, did the EPA delineation, was that any effort to define a clean edge as you described it, or was that?
No.
How does that relate?
The EPA delineation was basically what they viewed as the regulated unit. And so, no, it was not based on trying to find a clean edge. It was based on, this is the area that we think we have regulated. And again, not to get too far into the regulatory tall weeds, but the concept of the beneficial reuse or the beneficial use of ash is understood by both the state and the federal government as something to have been permitted and actually still to be permitted going forward. The past use they have to be a little more lenient on because they have no ability to evaluate the process, hindsight being 2020. Now they have more restrictions on. So if you said, oh, we were going to put ash and fill up the area of, this low spot in somewhere, you'd have to go through a multi-step process to be able to do that. But there is a recognition that previously used ash that was used for a beneficial purpose can remain where it is. And so that's the difference between the regulated unit, which is sort of this odd, I call it a butterfly shape. It's sort of it looks a little peculiar, and the remainder of the island. There is a regulatory difference. Is there a practical difference? There may be, and certainly the ash that was out there beneficially is older and probably has seen more of its constituents degrade or migrate. But it's not really a practical difference. The ash that was outside the impoundment is probably pretty similar to the ash that was inside the impoundment. The difference is its regulatory status.
Do you have a diagram that shows this 18-acre section? So we kind of have an idea of what we're looking at?
I don't know that we do, but we can probably provide
We can
one.
get one.
Yeah.
We do have a drawing on our website that we've shown regularly that delineates
Correct.
the smaller area.
That was in their packet in March
Right.
as well.
The 18 acres is with regard to 1, 2, not number 3.
Correct. I think they were trying to draw basically a big circle around 1 and 2 and said, well, just for purposes of evaluation, if we were going to do this whole large area, here's what it would entail.
And the estimate was 21 million for 18
21 million to close it in place,
and 40.
48 to remove it and dispose of it, because there you've got to dig up a lot more material. That's going to take you a lot more expense. And then you've got to haul it, and then you got to pay to dispose of it. So I can't say that's the only reason, but and you need more sheet piling, I suppose, a little bit, but those are the biggest reasons for the expense. The excavation, again, it was 5,000 tons versus almost 350,000 tons. And you're paying not only to remove it, but also to haul it and dispose it.
Does that include dewatering
Yeah.
activities during that as well?
Yes. And so you're going to be doing probably more dewatering, not probably, you will be doing more dewatering to remove the entire area rather than just trying to remove the water from the surface area and then cap it. So that's right.
That was the staff not bringing anything in to replace it.
I'm sorry?
That was, when you remove, you said you have a price to remove it and dispose of it, but nothing was said on the replacement of what was taken.
That's a great question. That's a great question.
You don't have to.
I don't believe,
Right?
If you remove it all, you don't have to fill. Right?
well, you'll have a very large hole in the ground. I'm looking now and no, that did include backfilling with clean fill.
Okay.
So that's another expense because you're going to be replacing all of that material. Literally, thank you for asking. It's a great question. Literally, the cost of the backfill, including, getting it, placing it, and compacting it in place, is just over $9 million of that $48 million figure. So yes, you're absolutely right. It wouldn't be a big hole in the ground. It would not be a big, like, swimming pool.
Arthur, this brings up a question that has been asked to me and I don't know the answer to it, so I'm going to ask you. If we remove it, can the EPA or Eagle prevent us from putting fill back in? I mean, obviously, when we take it out, it's going to be a quote wetland. All right. Does that mean that it's a regulated wetland and we can't fill it back in again? Or would that be not necessarily a concern?
Let's break that into a couple of pieces. And I'm not sure that I know the answers to all of them, but the first piece is that there are wetlands in that area. And I think either way, whether you're going to cap it or remove it, you're going to need to get a wetland permit and either provide mitigation wetlands or buy wetland credits. Again, that's an additional expense. If you're removing a larger area, you're going to impact more. You're going to have to spend more on wetland credits. At that point, you'll be able to excavate the material out of the wetland, and it won't be regulated at that point because you'll have a permit. The bigger issue as far as replacing the material, bless you. One of the issues is that you have to, and this is what I was talking about before, you have to confirm that you have removed all of it if you're trying to get a closure granted that would not require continued monitoring or maintenance or something like that. So your issues are both, literally in 5 different directions, right? East, west, north, south, and down. And the delineate, basically confirming that you've achieved a clean edge all the way around is going to be very problematic. The answer is if you could demonstrate that, which I don't think is practically viable, but if you could, then the agency would have no objection to you backfilling the hole. If you backfill the hole without getting that approval, the agency's view is you've just capped waste in place. They may ask you to get a permit as a landfill. We haven't gotten that far in the dialogue because the premise from 2019 was a clean removal. The work that's been done by your staff and by Golder in the last 2 years has revealed this to be, I think, far more complicated and complex to achieve that goal that easily. And we can talk about what my recommendation is later, but certainly I have thoughts about that. The next issue, and we've talked about some of this already, is groundwater monitoring. And that is covered in the letter as well. it's covered sort of in bits in different places throughout the letter. Basically, as I said, the agency is, Eagle, that is asking for more wells following the investigation of groundwater flow direction. And, the staff has done a lot of work with Golder over the last 4 years, I guess it is, maybe a little bit longer, with groundwater monitoring. I mean, before the federal regulations kicked in, there was no requirement for groundwater monitoring of one of these units. At the state level, there was no requirement for groundwater monitoring of one of these units until, I guess it was, the end of 2018, the beginning of 2019. Your folks were already doing monitoring before that, and they have added monitoring wells as deemed appropriate, either by them, the consultants, or as requested by the agency. So all three. The number of wells has doubled, I think, over the last 4 years. Is that right?
Yeah, it's more than double.
More than doubled. You can always put in more monitoring wells, and it is sort of like a shot in the dark. How many is enough? Given the issue with, and this is an important point, given the issue with the Unit 1-2 impoundment, it would have been very problematic to put in more wells until that issue was resolved. Because if you put them in a place that the agency said was part of the regulated unit, then you're not monitoring the edge of the regulated unit. You're sampling the interior. If you put it in an area that we thought was outside the regulated unit, as EPA requested, we may not be close enough. We may be too far away. So we had to have a definition of the boundary of the impoundment before we looked at the issue of monitoring.
Have any of the proposed wells been installed yet? And do we have any data?
Eric, I don't think you've installed the new wells yet.
Somewhere?
You can use this one if you want.
Just push this button.
So the piezometer plan was approved mid-June. You guys just approved tonight the drilling and installation and oversight of the piezometers. 3 days after the piezometer plan got approved by Eagle, and EPA made no comment on, which is fine, that's all we need. They won't give approval. They just, if they have a problem, they'll give you a comment, but their process isn't an approval, they make comment. You decide whether you agree with it or you don't. We agreed with it. We submitted the permit application for the wetlands 3 days afterwards. So now we're waiting for the wetland permit to get approved, and so no, they're not in yet. But we're moving as fast as we can based on their process.
22, is that how many?
It's 22 additional. It's gonna put you up to around 32 wells total. So you can see this thing is morphed, right? You started with none, 2017, you had 4. Then they wanted an additional well. We put that in. Then they said, you know what? Now we think we need an additional 4. We put those 4 in. It's morphed from nothing to 4 to 5 to 10. And now it's skyrocketing up to 32. And it's not really the number of wells that's a concern, because we do need to make sure we've adequately defined the contamination, where it's coming from, where it's going to. But things change and you have to change your plans or adapt as we receive record high water levels in 2020 and the groundwater flow reverses. Well, that's new. And so those are things you can't see coming, or you discover PFAS. That's new. Okay.
These wells are able to tell you which direction the groundwater.
Yeah, you take the static water level reading in each well. And so that's how you determine which way the groundwater is flowing, right? It flows downhill. In some areas like in the Unit 1 and 2 impoundment, we get a really hard rain event. We'll see a mounding effect. So if the water level seeps through from the impoundments, it'll kind of go from north to south, but we get a really heavy rain event, just like what we had a couple of weeks ago, and you'll see a mounding in Units 1 and 2, and it'll push its way out. So that changes again. It isn't just river level, it's rainfall and the effects that have. So it's a really interesting site based on all the changing conditions, but it's also a really challenging site to just pick your path and go. You can't do that. You got to be flexible.
The answer to your question really is, to be short, is yes. But the more wells you have, particularly when you have a complicated site, the better definition you're going to get on the groundwater flow.
So
How
Eric,
long do they think they need data to make a determination?
That's a great question. What we've heard is one round of sampling. What we expect is they're going to want more, particularly depending on what happens over the next 6 to 9 months to a year in terms of rainfall, river levels. I as a non-technical person, but I've been doing this for 35 years, I would absolutely expect that they're going to want more data than just one round. But it's possible that the one round of data that we're gathering may just confirm everything, and because it does cover the site more narrowly, more individually. It may be enough to satisfy both agencies that we really know which way it's going.
really the piezometers are going to tell you more about where the wells ought to have been.
Yes.
That's
I mean,
exactly right.
so you're putting wells now to find out where wells should be. So so the fact that it might be iterative is not surprising.
Exactly. That's
Once the
exactly right.
plan is approved, what do you anticipate the timeline to be to get to the point where the wells are in and you've got your first bucket of data?
Well,
How long?
I don't think we're talking that long. I mean, I think the big holdup right now is the issue is, well, let me talk it through. The big holdup right now is the wetland thing. But I expect that once that issue is ironed out and there's a wetland permit issued and basically, I think we talked about this, and once we get the go-ahead to be able to actually install all these wells and piezometers and wells, they'll be out there, assuming that the staff is available and the drillers are available. They'll be out there in less than a month, and the data will be back in probably, again, about a month. So we should have data. I mean, there might be some analysis, but in a couple of months, 2 to 2.5 months, I would imagine, from the point at which they say yes, not 2.5 months from today, but 2.5 months from the point at which Eagle says, yes, we will permit you to put wells in the wetlands. At that point, we'll go out and do them.
And they have the plan now?
They've had it since, 3 weeks ago now?
The piezometer plan?
Yeah.
Eagle has had the piezometer plan and EPA since April, but they approved it in June.
Right.
At the end of June,
Oh, it is?
you approved the work tonight. And so we're going to get out there, but just so you guys understand, my intention or my recommendation at least is, yes, they want us to do a groundwater flow study. I would sample this water and run the analysis on all the parameters. Why wait? To just do a study for groundwater flow, and if there's some complexity to where they can't agree or they need maybe additional piezometers or there's just some weirdness going on, we're just delaying and kicking the can down the road, and we do have to take action at some point. And so my recommendation, at least to Dave and the board, is going to be sample the wells for the parameters, or the piezometers, I should say. I'm sorry, sample the piezometers, and we will have to sink additional wells once we learn more about this piezometer program, but I should try to do this in a stepwise, piecemeal fashion. We will never get to an end game.
So if they've approved the plan, then we're talking about maybe 2.5 months to have data?
Well, they've approved the plan. They haven't issued the wetland permit yet.
Oh,
So it's once the wetland permit is issued, that'll start that 2.5 month clock. And I'm probably being a little conservative. It might be closer to 2 months. But we can't go out there and start putting holes in until Eagle, the right hand or the left hand, whichever hand it is, tells us that we can do that. So yes, I mean, the hope would be we'd get this permit issue. And again, we found out just today that they're objecting to making some of these piezometers in the wetland areas permanent. Once we resolve that issue, we should be able to get this resolved very quickly. I mean, my hope would be you'd be out in the field before the end of August and we'd have data before the end of September. That would be my hope. But again, right now that's out of our hands. It's in the hands of the water resources folks at Eagle.
But I think the important note there is that just gets us data. That doesn't get us agreement on what we're going to do with the data. And
Correct.
that could take a long time
Correct.
after that.
Correct. Although, again, and you're right, it depends on what it shows. If it confirms what Golder has been saying that they think the flow direction is, and they're placing these piezometers in places that they think and that Eagle agrees are going to help test that hypothesis that it's sort of a radial flow. We will, we will know fairly quickly whether or not we think it works. If the data comes back completely different than we expect, yeah, you're right. There's going to be a lot more discussion about, well, then where does the monitoring system go? What's upgraded and what's downgraded? So that's absolutely right. So it's not like, the data comes in September and you're out there putting in new monitoring wells in October. It could happen, but it's not likely. But certainly, I mean, you guys have been moving very quickly. There's been a lot of dialogue. I mean, literally from mid-January until April for the piezometer plan. It didn't get approved until June. Without there having been a vote by this board to fund that work, the BLP went and applied for the wetland permits because they knew that would take time and they wanted to get that process moving so that they could be ready to move once you gave them the go-ahead and once Eagle gave them the go-ahead. So, I mean, this has been moving pretty briskly as a result of the staff's efforts. That brings us to sort of the last issue that I wanted to put on the table for tonight. Before we talk about what do you do with all this information, and it's something that you probably have read about, which is as part of the discussion, and this is the reason we went in this order rather than the order in my letter, as a result of the issues for closing the impoundment, one way or the other, whether it's dewatering and removing, or removing and managing the water, or if it's closing in place, which is going to require dewatering as well, we knew that there was going to have to be water managed because there's a lot of water in the middle of this island and at the site, that the water was going to have to be removed and managed. And up until now, basically, as required, the BLP has been sampling for constituents that you would find in coal ash, which is primarily metals. Makes sense. They're not sampling for PCBs or pesticides or petroleum, because those things you would not expect to find in coal ash, and Eagle isn't requiring it, EPA isn't requiring it, nobody's asking for it. There's no reason to believe that would be in the coal ash. But when the issue came up of, well, we're going to have to move forward with closure of the Unit 1 and 2 impoundment, which is quite inundated with water, the issue was, well, what do we do about the groundwater at the island? Are we sure that if we start dewatering this, that we know how the water needs to be managed? The last thing anybody at this table, I'm sure, wants is for contaminated water to be discharged into the Grand River. I mean, that's a fairly obvious, I think, position. So the staff went without Eagle's direction, but we knew we were going to get there when this issue came up, and sampled their existing monitoring wells for an entire suite of constituents beyond just the metals that they were required to sample for. This was something they did on their own initiative. Eagle didn't tell them to do it. EPA didn't tell them to do it. It was, we need to start planning for closure of Unit 1 and 2. We got to know what's in the groundwater. And they came back with a number of constituents, a handful of which, nitrogen and ammonia. I'm trying to remember if there was a third one that was
Cyanide.
Thank you. That are not consistent with coal ash, but are found in other wastes. Just happens that they sampled for an entire suite of contaminants. That was what they found. Those in and of themselves are not particularly problematic and probably can be managed. But they also sampled for PFAS compounds. And I know you folks are familiar with that, with at least the general issue of PFAS. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but we haven't talked about this before because it wasn't on the table the last time. And this is really a fairly significant issue. PFAS compounds, without going into all the painful detail, are a series of very long chain, stable molecules. They're hard to break down, which is one of the reasons they're good. And they're hard to break down, which is one of the reasons why they're bad. They have been shown to cause various health effects, birth defects in some instances, and other thyroid problems, I believe, a number of health impacts. And this is what are referred to as an emerging contaminant. This is something the state has taken notice of in the last 3 years, maybe 3.5 years. Other states have started taking notice of it as well. Michigan actually has been fairly aggressive in its addressing of this. They've created Governor Snyder created a task force to work on this. Governor Whitmer has continued. That task force brings together a number of experts under the state umbrella to address the issue of these PFAS compounds. And just to be clear, people talk about PFAS. there's like 500 different compounds. PFAS is just one of them, but it sort of falls under that umbrella name. And these compounds were used for a variety of things, making Teflon, waterproofing clothing and furniture and carpeting, tanneries, hides, thank you, tanneries, and aqueous firefighting foam. So like when they're putting out, you go to any airport and you hear stories about, oh, we're going to foam the runway. That foam had PFAS compounds in it because it was incredibly stable. And it would keep the foam there and it would keep it from breaking down in a fire. So those kinds of compounds, and there's many other industrial uses and commercial uses for those compounds, but those are the ones people know about the most. So that was also sampled for and analyzed for as part of this process of, well, what are we going to do with this water? And I will tell you, without going through the numeric details, until last August, the state of Michigan followed the EPA guidance. There's a screening level that EPA uses, which is 70 parts per trillion. If you want to know what a part per trillion is, I believe if my math is correct, it's 1 drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So it's very, very, very dilute. But that's the screening level that EPA has been using and is still using, as far as I know. They've talked about ratcheting it down, not up. The sampling was done. Michigan changed its numbers, its standards last summer, and has continued to add new standards for different compounds. I don't have these committed to memory, but I can tell you that for some of the compounds, it is as low as 6 parts per trillion. So it's a very, very conservative approach. It's a very small number. PFAS compounds were analyzed for. A couple of those compounds were detected in the groundwater. None were detected in the river waters, or at least they were below any standard.
In the north.
Oh, right. There's one location where it was detected. That's right. Thank you.
In the river?
There was one detection in the river.
Nope. So, can I?
No, please.
So, and it's probably a good time to bring this up. So at the last board meeting is when we presented the information on the non-CCR constituent testing. And at that meeting, we said we would go out and resample within 10 days. And we did. We sampled on June 24th. And it takes about 3 weeks to get results back. And today is 3 weeks. We got the test results back today. Golder's got them and is reviewing them and is putting together a report that we hope to have on our website tomorrow. I think we will. It's almost there. It's in draft form. I did review them while they were working on it. And I can tell you this. So the results, the second set of confirmatory results, it's there on the island. The numbers were pretty close to what we saw on the monitoring wells in the first round. So we can feel fairly confident that the first set of tests weren't some anomaly. It's a real deal. But while we were waiting on these test results for the wells, we took it upon ourselves to sample the surrounding waterways. So we took a sample in the Grand River. We took a sample in the South Channel by the bridge. And we took 2 samples on the, I guess you want to call it a bay north of it's in Harbor Island, but it's that bay between the boat launch and the sim site. So we took it right at the edge of the sim site on the north side, 2 samples there. Those samples on that north end did show elevated levels above the drinking water standard for the PFOS. And again, we'll have that on our website. But the Grand River sample, non-detect, or not above the residential drinking water standards. The South Channel, not above the residential drinking water standards. So there is an issue, but fortunately the test results on the Grand River showed that it was below the residential drinking water standards.
This is pre-flowing surface water.
Yes, we just took it right out of the river, right at the edge of the river, I should say, right on the bank.
Do we have any idea out in the lake itself?
There was sampling done by EPA, and I think there was sampling done by the
Treatment plant.
by the treatment plant. I'd have to go back and look at the years. It was not this year, and they didn't have any detections of concern.
But they were sampling for PFAS?
Yes, that's correct. The PFAS issue is significant because it is this emerging contaminant that the agencies are concerned about. And it certainly has garnered the attention of Eagle. This first round of data, when it was reported to you, it was also reported to the agency. They have definitely sat up and taken notice. There was I can't remember if it was a letter or an email that was received that said, we're referring this to our MPART, which is the task force, the Michigan Task Force, PFAS Task Force, for further dialogue and further review. They have not gotten back to us since that first communication, but that first communication indicated that they anticipated scheduling a public meeting to discuss this. If the past at other sites, and there are a number of other sites that they've been dealing with, is any sort of prologue, and they've already started asking for more sampling, they will ask for more sampling, they'll ask for more analysis, they may ask for more investigation to be done to try to determine where the source is. And thus far, we don't know that there is a source. It may just be diffuse wastes, tannery wastes, or other wastes that have been placed in various parts of the island and not necessarily limited to just the SIM site. And they will, at that point, there'll be a dialogue about, well, how do we address this? Where we find ourselves is, and though, you know, that you've got, again, right hand, and I don't know how many hands we've got, you've got and these are all Eagle divisions. You've got the MMD, which is basically the Waste Management Division, which has taken the lead on this site because the ash regulations fall under those waste regulations. They've taken the lead thus far, and a staff member from that MMD has been who we've been dealing with, has been designated as the point person to work with MPART on this site. There is the Part 201, and we talked about this a little bit the last time, folks, the RRD, that's the division, but basically it's the Superfund cleanup type folks who need to be engaged on this. There is the water resources folks who have raised concerns about the wetlands, the monitoring wells, the water management at the site, and now impact from PFAS on the groundwater. And then the MPART team itself. They've got this sort of multidisciplinary team. So we're dealing with basically 4 different entities at a minimum. Did I forget any?
I'm sure, but
4 different entities at Eagle at the same time.
Well, just the dump people, but they're kind of in with the MPART people.
Well, so are the Part 201 folks and the Water Resources Commission, as well as the Health Department. They're all involved in different ways with the MPART team. That's correct. But we're also dealing with them individually. So we're dealing. That's why I listed them separately. We're dealing with each of these entities individually as they all sort of put in their 2 cents worth on how this is to be addressed. And how that's going to play out, I'd like to discuss with you a little bit more as it relates to legal theory, legal strategy, and our recommendations for how to proceed here. But that pretty much sums up. I know it's a lot of ground and it's a lot of information, and some of you were just hit with it for the first time tonight. There are different approaches here. We can approach this either in a piecemeal fashion or in a holistic fashion. There's different ways to address this. But before we jump into how to respond to this information and how to address it and the risks and liabilities that it poses to the BLP, to the city at large, I guess I want to make sure that if there are questions, and you've been good about asking them, but if there are other questions you have about what's happened, because this letter really just sums up what's happened in the last 6 months. As you can see, it's a lot. There's a lot going on. There's been a lot of moving parts, a lot of correspondence, a lot of back and forth, and a lot of topics. So if you have more specific questions you want to ask now, certainly you can ask them later. But if you have questions now that would help inform a dialogue regarding liability and strategy, I welcome them. To the extent I can answer them, we'll try.
Is PFAS, if water that contains PFAS is put on the ground, then is it a danger health-wise? if it isn't drunk, if it's just laid on the ground?
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer for you. The straightforward answer is, right now, the agencies are focusing, as you gleaned, primarily on drinking water. Is it in the water that you're drinking? And that, I think, probably for the foreseeable future and maybe forever, will be the primary pathway of concern. They want to make sure you're not drinking this, because if you do, it's bioaccumulative. It'll stay in your tissues. There is some concern